Dr. Lisa Littman.
Hi, thanks for having me. I think this has been a wonderful event. The speakers have been great, and it's really tough to follow all the speakers that came before me. And thanks to the audience for sticking around. It's been about 2 hours that we've all been together. So I am going to start by talking about gender dysphoria and psychosocial factors. And many of you may be familiar with my work, and some people may have signed on because they like the research, and some maybe because they hate the research, and just wanted to mention again, as others had, that this is a controversial topic. All right, so I thought I would start by sharing my values and where I'm coming from and what, which values are really relevant to the work that I do. So first, I am pro-LGBT, and I support LGBT people and rights. And I am pro-prioritizing the health and well-being of all people who experience gender dysphoria. And by this, I mean people who have been helped by transition and people who have been harmed by transition. People who have had gender dysphoria that persisted, people who had gender dysphoria that desisted, people who had underlying conditions for their gender dysphoria, and those who had not. And then the final thing I will mention here is that I am pro asking research questions to better understand a condition. So we've talked a bit about rapid onset gender dysphoria, and I'm just going to talk about as well the term ROGD, as well as the hypotheses that were generated from my research. So when I started to explore this topic, I needed a term to use when talking about it, when writing about it. And so I coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria as a descriptive term to describe a phenomenon where teens and young adults who lacked observable signs of gender dysphoria or gender incongruence during their childhood became gender dysphoric or transgender identified during or after puberty. And so I didn't have to say ROGD. Other people don't have to use the term ROGD. Some might say late onset gender dysphoria in adolescents and young adults. A rose has many names, or a rose by any other name. So it is not a formal diagnosis. The research on this topic is very early. And so I'm just pointing that out there. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are organizations who are strongly opposed to using the term ROGD and are opposed to the concept of ROGD. So what is this hypothesis that I'm talking about? Psychosocial factors in gender dysphoria. And so these I might call the ROGD hypotheses that came from my research. And broadly stated, they are that psychosocial factors such as social influence, maladaptive coping mechanisms, internalized homophobia, trauma, and mental health conditions can cause or contribute to the development of gender dysphoria in some individuals. The reason I've underlined some, and I'm going to point out that it's very, very obvious, but some does not mean all, and some does not mean none. So my research does not apply to all people who have gender dysphoria, and it should not be used to imply that everyone who is gender dysphoric had this kind of experience. My research is one piece of the puzzle in figuring out this topic. So I have little puzzle pieces here. So, for example, talking about ROGD, maybe one piece. Other people may not have these experiences, and so this does not disprove one or the other. So just in a little bit less polarized example, if I were studying type 2 diabetes, then I would not be implying that everybody has type 2 diabetes. And related to that, if somebody else is studying or finds that individuals have type 1 diabetes, that does not disprove all of the research about type 2 diabetes. all of these areas, all of these experiences, all of this research really are parts of the bigger picture. So, why is this so controversial? And I have to say, I have been thinking long and hard about this topic starting from, let's say, the day after my study was published. So, this is why I think it's controversial. So, currently, there is a public debate, there's clinical debate, and I believe people are basically arguing from the positions of two conceptual models for gender dysphoria. And so I'm going to talk right now about a developmental model for gender dysphoria and an innate gender identity model, which you might call gender theory, you might call a gender affirmative model. So from a developmental model, gender dysphoria may develop in the context of different kinds of cognitive, psychological, social, relationship processes. And the context is important because what you would do to help that patient is different. So for example, someone may become gender dysphoric because they are a young boy who is being bullied for liking ballet dancing, or a teenager who is discovering that she is same-sex attracted and having difficulty accepting herself as lesbian. Gender dysphoria might emerge after the trauma of a rape, and gender dysphoria might emerge in the absence of all of those things. And so the context is important because you would not treat somebody who develops gender dysphoria right after being raped the same way as you would somebody who's had gender dysphoria without any issues. So this is really viewed, gender dysphoria, as something that can have multiple causes, multiple treatments. Now, we don't have clear-cut causes, but just, I'm speaking conceptually. So context is important. Psychological issues, if they coexist with gender dysphoria, could possibly be underlying conditions for gender dysphoria. And I'm talking about the developmental model of gender dysphoria. From the developmental perspective, the desistance research is acknowledged within the strengths and limitations of the research. And as you would imagine, approaches really employ a thorough evaluation. So approaches that are consistent with the developmental model are a developmentally informed biopsychosocial approach, a systems approach, an exploratory approach. And these employ thorough evaluation and a judicious use of medical and surgical transition. So in contrast, there is the innate gender identity model. And this is more of a one cause, one treatment belief. So in this model, it's believed that there is an entity called a gender identity that represents a person's true self. And this gender identity may either match or not match one's biological body. And this is the source of gender dysphoria. And the treatment for this is transition. And because this is more simplified, the context is really not important. Psychological issues are thought not to be underlying conditions. And I'm just going to point out that's really more in practice than what's written. So the way it's written is that psychological issues are unlikely to be underlying or so, if you're thinking about psychological issues, the direction of, you can think that gender dysphoria might cause psychological issues, such as from discrimination and poor treatment, or that psychological issues may be completely unrelated, or you can conceptualize psychological issues as underlying. And so in practice, the suggestion of underlying conditions is often met with hostility and calls that that's transphobic. So this is the more extreme version. The desistance research in the innate gender identity model is rejected. And these approaches are approaches that have minimal or even absent evaluation and liberal use of transition. So the informed consent model requires no mental health evaluation before accessing transition. And this is for individuals 18 and older. And it's popular in the United States right now. And I do need to point out that the gender identity affirmative approach, there are people having a debate within this about what is the role of the evaluation, because recently, three very prominent members of WPATH have spoken out and saying that they are concerned about the lack of evaluation, because there is a trend of clinicians bypassing or considering that the affirmative model means that individuals don't need an evaluation. So, in other words, to say it more succinctly, the priorities for a developmental model are making the correct diagnosis and providing the correct treatment. And from the innate gender identity model, the priority really is quick access to transition. And people in both of these models believe that what they're doing is helping people, but you can understand why there would be a clash of priorities, because the folks from the innate gender identity model will view developmental model as being an unnecessary delay to transition. Transition is believed to be the answer, and delay is seen as harmful. Coming from the developmental model, there is concern that this quick access to transition is failing to diagnose important conditions and providing the wrong treatment to some individuals. So the reason that I believe the developmental model is superior is because there are a lot of outcomes for gender dysphoria and transition. And we know people who have all of, who could be categorized in each of these. And we have research that describes these different outcomes. And so the developmental model accommodates all of these outcomes. Oh, whoops, I'm going to go back. So I just wanted to say, as everybody probably knows, so gender dysphoria may persist, it may desist. Someone may be satisfied with transition. They may only detransition because they are discriminated against, and they might detransition and not regret their transition. But there are people who are dissatisfied with their transitions, who detransition and regret that transition. So moving on, the innate gender identity model, in contrast, only accommodates some of these outcomes. So so you can see where this information and these individuals and research about these topics challenge this model. And so what I've seen is that there are some behaviors that I think raise some concerns that people might be coming a little ideological around this topic in this quick transition approach, because typically, you would use data to inform your model and not take the model and take your approach to decide to reject data and people. So, we've seen individuals and groups that deny desisters or really try and discredit detransitioners who regret transition. And we've seen some double standards applied to research. And so personally, I don't think that this approach is compassionate to the people who have these experiences that are not consistent with the affirmative model. And I don't think it's scientific to do so. So in a nutshell, why do I think that my work is so controversial? After thinking long and hard, I think it's because my research it challenges the model and the approach to quick transition.